Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live chat. And of course, today we're going to be talking about the brutal dissolution of the monasteries. And our guest today is going to tell us and show us just how divisive, and brutal this whole process was. So, I think by the end of today's live chat, you're probably going to be looking at the dissolution of the monasteries, which just trips off the tongue, doesn't it? In perhaps a different and maybe more emotional way. I know that's how I felt when I met with Michael for the first time. But of course, for those of you who don't know me, it's Sarah and I'm the Tudor Travel Guide. And welcome, welcome, welcome. I can see that we already have people online, so it's lovely to see you here. And while we give people just a chance to turn up before we begin our live chat today, I just want to say hello to a few people. So hello to all our new members of the YouTube channel. Of course, the Tudor Travel Guys has a Time Travelers Club YouTube membership, and we have some new members today, Alicia and Amanda. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay, so what I'd love you to do is, if you are joining the live chat, do say hello. Let me know who's here. I love to know who's in the house and to catch up with some old friends, no doubt, and meet some new folk. And thank you so much already for the thumbs up and the hearts. Do make sure that you do that as you go along. That helps spread the love. And of course, if you can and you want to share this, then please feel free to go ahead and do so. So at the moment, I'm not getting any chat coming through. So if anybody could type in the live chat for me and let me know you're here and that that's working, I'd be most appreciative. As I say, I can see your thumbs up happening. Because, of course, I want to be able to take your questions live. Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Sarah. It's Adrian from Manchester. Thank you so much, Adrian, for letting me know that you're there and that the live chat is working. And hi, Anna. Anna, it's lovely to see you. And Debbie. Hi, Debbie. Debbie from California. Lovely, lovely. And Natalie. Hi, Natalie Miller. Hello, Sarah. Good to have you back from the holidays. Yes, of course, we did take a break over the Christmas period, but now we are back with our new live chat sessions, which, generally speaking, and I'll come back to this at the end of today's live chat, will be taking place on the first Saturday of the month. But of course, because it was just after New Year, etc., we are doing this a little bit later than normal. Wow, there's loads of people coming in. So let me say hello to a few more people. Jenny, Stratford-upon-Avon, so you're just up the road from me. And hi from Makado7 and Amy. Hi, Amy. Thanks for the heart. And Debbie in Suffolk near Bury St Edmunds. Lovely Bury St Edmunds. It's one of my favourite places. Lovely. Oh, and we have Jew from Israel. Wow, Israel. I don't think we've had anybody on the live chat from Israel before, so it's great to see you. Welcome. And we've got New Jersey and Argentina and Augusta and Leeds. Well, that's my home county up there in Yorkshire, so you're most welcome. Okay, so with all the hellos and welcomes, I just wanted to say, of course, that these live chats run for about an hour. And we're going to have the pleasure of the company of our guests for just about an hour till just coming up to 6 o'clock. So I want you to ask as many of the questions that you have about the dissolution of the monasteries, or in fact any particular question related to monasticism or any particular monastery you know and love. So feel free to put those in the chat. I'll be kicking off the chat in a moment with our guests, but as I say, I'll be keeping an eye on that live chat and I'll move over to your questions as soon as we can. So, okay, that's totally enough talking from me. With that, I want to come over and introduce our guest today. Now, of course, our live chat guest is Michael Carter, who is Senior Properties Curator with English Heritage and an expert on monasticism and the Cistercian order in particular. So without waiting anymore, I want to bring Michael in. Hello, Michael. Welcome.
Hello. Hello. I was going to say good evening, but then just hearing where everybody is, it's good whatever time of day it is where you are.
It is, isn't it? It's amazing, isn't it, that we can connect with people all over the world. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So, Michael, thanks ever so much for joining us today. It's such an interesting topic, the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, you and I met last year up at Revo Abbey. We recorded a podcast, and I just want to point out to folks that there is a link to that podcast in the description below. So don't go anywhere yet. But if you want to hear Michael and I chat on location at Revo, and it's always very atmospheric when you're on location, then do make sure you check that out. But Michael, maybe you can introduce yourself. What's your passion all about? What do you do at English Heritage?
Well, I'm a historian at English Heritage, and I'm employed specifically to research the monasteries. And we have, oh gosh, some of the best monastic sites anywhere in England under our care. For instance, there's Revo Abbey, and there's St. Augustine's Abbey, and there's Battle Abbey, Hales Abbey. They're dotted all across England. And I just undertake the general research on them to, as an academic historian, which is what I am. But also I do research to support English heritage presentation of the sites for the visiting public. And we're always updating these to make sure they're relevant, to tell new stories in a fresh way. And since joining, I've worked on major new interpretation projects at Revo, Whitby, Hales, and there are forthcoming ones, a monastery called Muchelney, various smaller sites as well, Byland, Bayham, and they've all got fascinating stories to tell, and they tell a story of monasticism for the best part of 1,000 years. So when we get to the dissolution of the monasteries, we're talking about the extinguishing a way of life that had been present in England since the end of the 6th century. Now, it evolved considerably over that time, but it was part of the English landscape in every single sense of the word. And I think this is one of the reasons why it is such an important fissure in English history. And why I think a lot of the traditional historiography of it, which has very much been told from the winning side, hasn't done justice to just how destructive it was, both in terms of the buildings, the property of the monasteries, and also in lives and also in identity as well. The dissolution fundamentally reshapes the English national identity. Now, I will be talking about England. Dissolutions happen in Wales, in Ireland, and in Scotland, but it's always dangerous for a historian to stray out of their historical specialism. And although I know a little bit about the dissolutions in Ireland and Scotland, I'll be focusing first and foremost on England. There'll be perhaps a little bit of continental context at various times, because I think some of this is very, very important when we get some recent historians try to let some key players off the hook for their role in the dissolution of the monasteries. And you look at what's happening in some other bits of Europe, and the charge sheet doesn't look as blank as some people are suggesting in comparison, but it is just by the way of context.
Well, we've already got questions pouring in, actually, Michael. Wow. But I think before I go to those, I'm just going to ask one question that sets the scene, and then we will come over to you guys on live chat, and I'm going to start pulling your questions in. So, I wondered if you could set the scene. This is the dawn of the Tudor age. It's the turn of the 16th century. Can you help us understand the roles that monasteries played in society, at that time, from the very poorest in the society? What was their relationship to the monastery? Why were they important? To the most aristocratic in the land. And then maybe from there, as I say, we can dive into these questions because they're coming in thick and fast.
Well, as I said, in about 1500, there were about 800 religious houses, great and small, dotted around the English landscape. And apart from the most thinly populated bits of the country, you probably wouldn't be more than a day's walk from a monastery. And people from princes to paupers would have seen the monasteries as having a role in their life in some way. Now, first and foremost, this was still an intensely pious society, and the monasteries performed what was seen as being essential religious functions. Now, most people got their religion from parish churches, but monasteries also had a role that you would hear the bells of the monastery ringing 8 times a day, summoning the monks, nuns, friars, canons to prayer. And that was a reminder that they were there praying for all Christian souls. That if you were a major benefactor, well, you're a very top-notch person, very, very wealthy, your ancestors may well have founded that monastery, and their bones lay mouldering within the walls of them, and you yourself may intend to be buried there as well. And you would hope that the intercessory prayers of the monks or nuns, whatever, would help get your soul on an express elevator out of the pains of purgatory up to heaven. Poorer people might be the member of a monastery's sort of confraternity. That's a kind of lay brotherhood where you benefited spiritually from all the pious works of the monastery. Or you might be a tenant of the monastery, that you paid your rent to the monastery, and farm their land, or your son might be often educated at the monastery's free grammar school. It could be the case that you actually relied on the monastery for some distribution of charity, or people from across society could turn to them for hospitality. Monks were very important in the educational structures of early Tudor England. There were 4 or perhaps even 5 monastic colleges at Oxford alone, and there were numerous free grammar schools associated with monasteries. There were also schools at nunneries as well. So they have a massive role, and top flight clerics at monasteries, abbots and priors, are employed by the crown as local administrators, and even will be occupied positions at court or go on diplomatic missions on behalf of the crown. They are fundamentally embedded in English society at all levels, and their buildings are the glories of the land, and containing, even in the 16th century, this is acknowledged, cultural treasures which speak of the innermost religious needs of people at the time, but they're artistic wonders, and they're also treasures which shaped the English religious and national identity as well.
Wow. So, I mean, it's just in every part of society, isn't it? Just completely interwoven at every level in many different layers. So, we've already got somebody who's asking about the dissolution and how hands-on was Cromwell in the dissolution. I've read that he masterminded it, but did he actually physically oversee it? Now, we might be jumping ahead slightly in the story, but maybe therefore leading into answering that question, you could just talk about the kind of the perfect storm of events that catalyzed the collapse and the dissolution of the monasteries in England.
Yeah. Well, Thomas Cromwell's name will be coming up again and again and again in the story, and and his role is contested. There's Dermot McCulloch's recent biography of him has really set the cat among the pigeons to some extent, but yes, a number of events coalesced together in the early 16th century to create, as it is, a perfect storm for the monasteries. And now, first of all, there had been dissolutions before. The actual suppression of all the monasteries between 1536 and 1540 was actually building on some precedents in some ways. For instance, a number of monasteries had been closed down from the late 13th century onwards because they were so-called alien priories. They were dependent on a French mother house, and oh gosh, the constant wars between England and France, it complicates all that. And they're closed down, but all their endowments go to an English monastery. It's basically a transference of assets, or they merge with a monastery. And then some monasteries just are no longer viable. gosh, what is it? North Creek Abbey. I always get this wrong. This is the second time I've made this mistake. I was talking about it in the podcast. The community it's not economically viable anymore, or the community just dies out. And there are a few instances of that. They have been insecurely set up, or for the purpose they were first set up is no longer there. And then Cardinal Wolsey, and this is not the only guy to do it. Bishop Alcock of Ely does this as well. They suppress some smaller monasteries to fund educational institutions, But again, this is taking one set of pious endowments and putting them to another pious endowment. It's not terribly popular, it must be said in some instances, but it can happen. But then you get in the 16th century, you get the King's Great Matter, don't you? His attempts to divorce Catherine of Aragon, her spirited defense against it, and then at the same time this tying in to evangelical reform. It's what we used to be called but it's Protestant. It turns into Protestantism, but the preferred term for it at the moment is evangelical. And there is criticism of the monastic life. Now, there's always been criticism of the monastic life. Monastic life, that monks and nuns find it very difficult to live up to the high standards set by their founders. And monastic histories are littered with what are called visitation reports. And if anyone is a British school teacher, they know what I mean when I say they were the equivalent of an Ofsted inspection from hell. That every single aspect of life in the monastery comes under scrutiny, and you can only find fault in those circumstances. But there's more focus on those faults, and there's even more of a Purian interest in them because of this heightened religious atmosphere. These pressures for reform that start in Germany, Martin Luther's Reformation in Germany, and they get adopted early on. They start to influence thinking over here. And it's not just are monks and nuns really virtuous people? It also starts to question their very existence and way of life. For according to Martin Luther, you are saved by your faith in Christ alone, and the good works done by monasteries and all their apparatus of prayers for the dead and things like that, they're just superfluous. So there's these things start to coalesce together. And then also don't forget that unlike his father, Henry VIII is chronically short of cash, and he likes spending money big time. And also that he likes fighting. Fighting is very, very expensive. And when you make enemies, which Henry does, you have to have adequate defenses against them. So he needs a source of cash. And he has people at his court who are going to catch his ear over religious matters, over where he can get money from. And also, we'll throw this in there, and I hope we'll get to it. Is there a case as well that, monasteries aren't very good, that they're letting us down, that can their endowments, as people have tried to do in the past, be put to other pious purposes? So all these are coming together.
So I'm just going to pause for a moment. And Mikado7 had actually asked a question. We may have answered your question, so do let us know. But if we haven't, perhaps you could just ask a second question. But the question was it really just because of the Reformation, so a political reason, or might it have happened in another way if there was not that excuse? But I think what we're saying was there are lots of different things that came together, political, social, cultural, religious, that catalyzed the whole thing.
One thing I think that always strikes me is when people talk about, the traditional English historiography of the dissolution of the monasteries and the Reformation is that, things are okay, in until about 1300, perhaps a little bit earlier. Then it all goes horribly wrong, and then Henry VIII purifies it all and puts the ghastly business of monasticism out of its misery. It ignores the fact that, thank you very much, monasticism continues very, very well indeed in large parts of Europe, and is only put out of, is only destroyed by the French Revolution or subsequent revolutions. It has that shows that there was certain life to it, a certain role to it. And also, if you look closely at the lives, internal histories of a lot of these monasteries, you don't see decline at all in around 1500. You are seeing a spring. You are seeing a renaissance in every single sense of the word.
Well, that was interesting. I know when I met you at Revo, you talked about that, because I think a lot of us have bought into the Tudor propaganda that it was just this vile den of iniquity, you know, and it all needed sorting out. But you were saying to me, no, 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 that's actually not what was going on, and perhaps it is that propaganda that, you know, the Tudors were so good at doing and that have convinced us that that was the case.
Well, I'm sure that so many people tuned in have heard of John Fox's Acton Monument, you know, Fox's Book of Martyrs. And that was instrumental in constructing a view of monasticism in English that has endured until modern times. It has to be honest. Now, I am not going to say that everything is well with monasticism, and it never was everything was well with monasticism. There are houses which are failing. There are instances of some absolutely appalling behavior by individual monks and nuns, and how some of the maladministration of some monasteries lasts for decades. They just don't, whoever's put in charge just isn't up to the job and sees it as a chance of living the high life and things like that. There certainly are those, but that doesn't mean that the whole institution was rotten. And I'd also add that if you look at monastic history from its earliest days in the late Roman Empire through into the very modern era, you constantly see internal attempts to reform it, to think, well, we could be doing things better. And in the late 15th, early 16th century, we're getting another wave of that monasticism is constantly reinventing itself. It might have this rule written by, somebody in the dying days of the late Roman Empire, which they are trying to live up to, but they're having to interpret it anew for the society that they're living in.
So, I mean, Natalie's asked a question here. Why didn't they try to fix what was wrong rather than destroying the whole thing?
Wow, this is a really, really interesting question. Now, you do have internal attempts at reform in the early 16th century, and as you always had. Now, there's a bloke called Marmaduke Hubie, who was abbot of Fountains, great Cistercian monastery in Yorkshire. He was abbot there between 1495 and 1526, and he has the role of reformator, the reformer of the order in England, and he goes to great lengths to try and reform the internal life of monasteries. And this happens there are numerous other instances of that. The preamble to the Act for the reform of smaller monasteries in 1536 talks about, making monasticism better in the big houses, and also the visitations which are conducted in 1535, both to assess wealth and the internal life of monasteries, are there with the express purpose of let's find fault and correct it. I don't think they for 1 minute wanted to correct any faults they found in monasteries in 1535. The visitations were done with the pure intention of finding fault to close them down. And I'm sure that some of the allegations made were absolutely true, but other ones just do not stand up to any kind of scrutiny whatsoever. For instance, 80-year-old nuns recently giving birth. And there's an almost prurient interest that's taken into the moral failings of monks and nuns, and it establishes in the English psyche that that set of visitations in the English studies, a kind of association between monasticism and Catholicism more generally with being unmanly or being some way sexually deviant, and it's something that comes up very, very strongly in 18th and 19th century Gothic fiction, and actually is used in anti-Catholic propaganda when Catholicism starts to return to England and monasticism starts to turn England in the 19th century.
That's interesting. Now, one of the questions I had, and I think Dew has kind of asked us similar questions, so I'll kind of merge the two. The characters who catalyze the dissolution. We've got Henry VIII, we've got Thomas Cromwell, we've got Anne Boleyn's role maybe somewhere in there. It'd be really interesting for you to maybe, and this is what Jew's asking, is saying, how much was it Cromwell, how much was this whole thing in Cromwell's interest? Did Henry VIII know what was going on? So I suppose my question that merges in with that is, who were the players? What were their agendas? What were they hoping to get out of this? And were they aligned?
Right, that's a really, really big question, and it's one which is, which Dermot McCulloch discusses very, very interestingly in his new book and offers a perspective. Now, the traditional one is that basically Henry and Thomas are like that in their intention. They've made a plan early on, and it's to, by going at it piecemeal and then to eradicate the whole thing. Well, Dermot McCulloch would argue otherwise, that and then every single person you can think of at the Tudor court is some way named as having a role in the dissolution of the monasteries as well. Yeah, you mentioned Anne Boleyn; she's certainly interested in it. Not as straightforward as you might think, as well, actually, and things like that. They all these very complicated relationships with monasteries. But anyway, the traditional interpretation is that, yep, both of them are after, hand in hand from the outset. Let's get rid of the thing and get as much cash out of it as possible. Well, they might have had different purposes. Is it to, the reforming agenda within the church and, purifying the church? Is it Henry seeing it his way of like creating a much better church? His idea of a kind of, it used to be called, his church was like Catholicism without monks and nuns, and I think it's probably much more complicated than that. And then it used to be that Thomas Cromwell, who's a committed Protestant, and he's there, getting rid of them all, and everyone, all his henchmen, all these royal commissioners that are appointed are all there to enrich themselves. But it is so much more complicated. Now, I do think that there was a powerful reform agenda from the beginning. Because otherwise, how do you explain that the orders which they go for first of all are very, very vibrant ones, and ones which people are held in huge respect? It's the observant Franciscans, and then the Carthusians as well. They're knocked out. They can't, for their resistance, it's like we will deal with you brutally as well. And that's also a very, very important stage in the dissolution early on. The dissolution, again, it's a very polite English word, and even more so the suppression. I think they're very polite English word, but it's easy to forget that people are beheaded, hung, drawn and quartered and burnt because they stand in Henry and Thomas Cromwell's way. And it's a reminder at each stage of the events. We have executions at each stage of the dissolution, and it's a reminder of what defying the royal will leads to. So I think there's that. And then, but Cromwell's role in it is contested and is very, very interesting. It had been seen that, he's this henchman out to enrich himself and Henry. Well, McCulloch would argue otherwise, that there's a principled agenda of evangelical reform there, and that he hoped to save a fairly substantial number of monasteries and turn them into what are called colleges of secular canons. That's priests live in a commercial, yeah, there's a Freudian slip, a communal life. But they wouldn't be singing for the prayers. They wouldn't be singing prayers for the soul, necessary for the souls of the benefactors anymore. Cromwell wasn't too keen on that, although that doesn't get abolished for years to come. It's more having an evangelical role, that they're there as centres for the gospel and as education, and that Cromwell wanted to save some of these, as was happening in Germany. Large numbers of former monasteries in Germany, the communities secularized themselves, or they somehow managed to accommodate their monastic existence within the confines of Lutheranism, or their monasteries are dissolved and then turned into schools and seminaries and the such like. And is it that Cromwell wants to do the same here? That's a big debate, and something which Dermot McCulloch argues for very, very strongly in his excellent biography of Thomas Cromwell. And we can get onto that later, and my view of it, perhaps.
Hey, yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely. So, what? How does this whole process get underway then, and how does it gain such momentum? And I definitely want to talk about kind of the, as I said at the top of this chat, the brutality of this, because I think
Mm.
it's so easy to miss really the savagery that was involved not only in the destruction of people and their way of life, but in the buildings themselves. And we saw that very much when I went round Revo with you. You did a great job at pointing out about how the building had just been hacked to pieces, and it was
Mm.
kind of metaphoric. But how did the whole thing get a kind of attraction if maybe it wasn't meant
Yeah.
to end up like that? It's almost like it just got out of control. How did that
Well,
happen?
yeah, it starts. Indeed, it starts 1534, 1535 with a small number of suppressions and executions. Then there are the sort of, it gathers pace. 1535, you have these two visitations: the valuation of church property, the valor ecclesiasticus, and then the visitation of monasteries to assess the moral conduct of monks and nuns, or whatever, and that's conducted under the authority of Thomas Cromwell as vice regent in ecclesiastical affairs. Henry's head of the church by then, and it all comes back, and the Act of Parliament is passed in 1536 for the suppression of the smaller or lesser monasteries. That's monasteries with an income of below £200 a year and fewer than 12 inmates. And I don't mean that in a prison sense, although some monks and nuns did think of it, gosh, they'd made vows in their teens and regretted it. They're allowed to leave anyway. But anyway, but the wording of the act is very pejorative. It says where manifest sin is practiced daily. And then the money, and then it's all meant to be about making monasticism better. The great houses aren't threatened at this time. Well, and it starts off, these smaller houses start to come down as suppressed, and some of them without any incident whatsoever. And the monks and nuns are given the option of going into a larger monastery, which is still standing. Some of them do, or leaving the religious life. And the monks, especially, a lot of them are already in priestly orders, so they can go off and find employment as a priest. But it gives you an idea of how deeply embedded the monasteries are, that it does indeed provoke resistance, as indeed had some of Wolsey's suppressions in the 1520s, for instance, at Bayham Abbey. And those suppressions in the 1520s had stoked up enmities and anger about the suppression of these monasteries that endured for decades. And then it kicks off, first of all, in the Lincolnshire Rebellion in the autumn of 1536, and then far more seriously, a series of rebellions across the northern counties, Yorkshire, Lancashire, and the counties north of that, which becomes known as a pilgrimage of grace. And it is a very, very serious rebellion indeed, and it leads to the restoration of some monastic communities which had just been suppressed. Sawley Abbey on the Yorkshire-Lancashire border is a good example, where I think the monks had been dispersed in May and they're restored in October. They'd all still been living in the locality. That's very interesting as well, I think, for them to be put back. And it's said to be by the loving consent of the commons that they are put back. And there is genuine enthusiasm for the monasteries around large parts of northern England. Now, the Pilgrimage of Grace isn't provoked by the dissolution of the monasteries at all. There's also fears that it's going to go even further, that Henry's going to attack the church in other ways. And there's also long-standing economic grievances that feed into it. But the monasteries are definitely a big part of it. And Henry the Pilgrims have a song called the Sawley Ballad. It's possibly written by the Abbot of Sawley, and it basically is justifying the taking of arms against Henry in defense of the church. And they march underneath a banner emblazoned with the wounds of Christ. And it's said that the banner still survives at Arundel Castle. If you Google Pilgrimage of Grace banner, you can see what it looked like.
Oh, good.
And that's a key emblem of late medieval traditional religion. It's a very popular devotion at that time. But also the idea that to with Christ's wounds at your front, what is it suggesting to you? That you're prepared to emulate Christ and shed your blood in defense of the church. And the marching song directs enmity towards Thomas Cromwell and a few of his other henchmen and supporters. And the king is in a very, very weak position. The Duke of Norfolk is dispatched with whatever army he can put together, and they parley near Doncaster and near the nunnery of Hampole. It's not too far away, and a sort of settlement is reached. That for one thing, the Pilgrims aren't too keen on rebelling. Taking arms against the king is it's a shocking thing to be doing. And they also have probably got a very good idea about what Henry will do if things get badly wrong, So it's a very, very complicated thing. And it's one of the what's if. It's counterfactual history, so we won't go there about, if they hadn't reached the agreement. But a number of monasteries become implicated in this. Must be said, often not very willingly at all. The monks might be quite keen and going, yes, let's defend the church. Abbots and priors are often going, oh, no. I really don't want to get involved in this, And,
wise, I have to say.
I wonder why. Wise. And then anyway, the rebellion breaks out again in early 1537, and that provides Henry with an excuse to move against the monasteries and the lead that had been implicated in it. And it leads to a series of monasteries falling to the crown by attainder. That's it, they're seized because of the treasonous heads. And these abbots and priors are condemned to death by being hung, drawn and quartered. The aged Abbot Paslew of Worley is one of them. He provided virtually no support to the Pilgrims. And indeed, the royal commander in the north is doubtful he could even secure a conviction. But Paslew had believed that a prophecy had foretold his death, that a monk had appeared to him in a dream telling him he'd die at a certain age, which he was, and he thought, oh, this is it, and he surrenders his monastery, destined to be hung, drawn and quartered. And the Abbot of Furness is absolutely terrified that a similar fate awaits him. And the Abbot of Furness has tried to play it both ways, but his monks, boy, were they a conservative group and really encouraged the rebels. And to save his and their necks, he agrees to the voluntary surrender of his monastery. Now that is seen as setting a legal precedent then for the surrender of the other greater monasteries, which were all still standing at this time without the need for any other legislation. But there's a pause. Furness comes down and another couple of monasteries come down, but it isn't yet clear that there's going to be wholesale dissolutions. They start again in a fairly big way in 1538, but as late as 1539, there's some evidence to think that the abbots of some bigger monasteries are hoping that they are going to escape one way or another, that either they'll be allowed to continue as a monastic community as constituted, or to convert them into a college of secular canons. The cathedral monasteries, places like Durham and Winchester, make that transition, but only two other monasteries do so. Thornton Priory is an English heritage site, that's one of them. And you have to ask yourself, Thomas Cromwell is famous for being a great, he's a great wheeler and dealer, isn't he? You read Dermot McCulloch's biography, and it is clear that he is constantly pushing Henry in an ever more evangelical agenda and slipping things past him in religious settlements that Henry doesn't realise all the serious of until it's actually happened. Ask yourself this. If Thomas Cromwell had been genuinely committed to saving some monasteries and turning them into colleges of secular canons, given how much else he had achieved in the Tudor Church along his agenda, why did only two non-monastic foundations make that transition? And I think that's a pretty damning statistic against this argument, to be perfectly honest. If it's constant, he was a massive manipulator and wheeler dealer and things like that. But, I'm not entirely convinced, to be honest.
Yeah, and Rusty's asked, did Cromwell take bribes when selling the
Oh,
monastery parcels?
mm,
Since we're talking about Cromwell, I'd love to
yeah,
come and talk about the actual physical destruction of the buildings in a moment. But yeah,
yeah, but he's meddling in the monasteries from the early 1530s, and an early example is Muchelney Abbey in Somerset, where an aged abbot is bullied by Henry and Cromwell into resigning. And he's replaced by an utterly unsuitable young monk of Muchelney called Thomas Ide. And he rapidly shows why he should never have been abbot. But there's a £200 bribe involved to be paid to Cromwell's local agent, and Cromwell is going to personally profit from this as well. And boy, as well, even if it's not bribery, there's chicanery going on all over the place, and there's also that kind of, it's almost like protection money that heads of monasteries across the country make out endowments to Cromwell, giving him a pension of £10 a year or something out of monastic funds. And it's trying to curry his favour. And Cromwell is making a huge amount of money out of the monasteries from the outset. And there are instances of bribery and corruption, individual. When the commissioners turn up to close down some smaller monasteries, it could be as simple as that they're showing very good hospitality and nicely greeted by the abbess or abbot or whoever, that, oh, I'm minded to spare you for a certain time, or some cash passes hands. And then the commissioners who oversee the suppression of the monasteries, although it's not like by chicanery, it's not, it's all above board, profit from this massively. It founds family fortunes that endure to this day.
And I seem to remember, I don't know whether you were telling me or I read that at Cromwell's death, when they took the inventory of his house, there was loads of monastic stuff.
Oh yeah,
in the cellar or something.
It's all loads of images and things like that get sent to him, because he wants to oversee their destruction and things like that. And but where do a lot of things, and I mean, it's interesting how a lot of the commissioners do act very, very scrupulously, actually, about, they get first pickings of some of the stuff that's been sold off. We'll get to the destruction. The cultural impact of the dissolution is often overlooked. Sometimes get first, I've been, I look at, inventories that are taken at the time, or documents or letters, and it's such and such, the commissioner has bought something, they do pay for it. I'm sure they get a very favorable rate. They like that that silver cup that's in the abbot's house or something. Or it's very interesting. Excuse me. It's very interesting. Well, they sometimes still buy investments and for use in their private chapels, and that's because the essential structures of the Roman Catholic Church, to use an anachronistic term, there's still the mass is still at the centre of it. So a lot of the paraphernalia of monasteries, the vestments, the candlesticks, would potentially have a buyer, so altar pieces. Anyway, sorry.
That's okay. But we are going to come on to sort of the effects of the dissolution. And I know we want to talk about the buildings, but I also definitely want to come to Jenny's question, who's been asking about what happened to the hundreds of monks and nuns, I guess, that were evicted or killed. What happens to the ones who had nowhere to go? So they survived, but they had nowhere to go. So maybe this is the time to talk about what actually happened.
All right. Okay. Well, when it comes to the second round of, the big dissolutions, the major houses after 1538, you're offered a pension as there's no more monasteries to go to. And the pension is sort of tied to the income of your house and also your status within the monastery. Now, the head of the monastery always gets the bigger pension. And if you're an abbot of a very large, or prior of a very large monastery, an important monastery, and especially if you have been very loyal to the regime, you are going to do very well indeed. It wasn't atypical for heads of larger monasteries and to be compliant to get pensions of £100 a year or more. That's well in excess of, it's very difficult to give modern day values, but it's well in excess of £100,000 a year. And you'd often get a luxury pad to go with it. And you would also keep various church dignities, the church titles you may have picked up. You're doing very well for yourself. Monks don't do quite as well. We're looking at, oh gosh, if you're lucky, you get £10, but more like 5 or 6 pension. But believe it or not, that's enough for you to, well, if not live comfortably, at least not to be in want. And then also, as I said, a lot of them are in holy orders, so they can get employment as a priest as well. Though there are so many of them, the market is suddenly flooded with clerical talent. How many are going to actually be able to do that? For nuns, it is a much, much harder tale. And Henry, being the prude, it could be unbelievable I'm going to say this, Henry being the prude that he is, will not release them from their vows of chastity, and they are forbidden to marry. Oh, no. And what are you going to do as a nun? And nuns get much, much smaller pensions, sometimes shillings a year. And for some of them, the only option is to go back to their families. And the idea that nunneries were just dumping grounds for unmarriageable daughters isn't entirely, it actually, it wasn't their primary purpose. But you could, gosh, these families, the middling or lower gentry families, and then this daughter comes back, has to be reintegrated into the household. You also get some extraordinary cases of community solidarity after the dissolution as well. You even get attempts of communities trying to stay together and live a quasi-monastic existence. There's several examples of this from Northern England. Monk Breton Priory is a good example. And for nuns, there's a very, very good instances from the nuns of Denny Abbey. 3 of the nuns of Denny Abbey coalesce around their last abbess, the formidable Elizabeth Throckmorton, and they retire to her family manor house, the upper floor of her family manor house at Coughton Court. But then they stay together as well in subtle ways as well, in close proximity to one another. They write to one another. And there are a very, very touching series of wills from the 1530s onwards, where they're leaving each other bequests. And it touchingly says, to each of my brethren or each of my sisters who was with me on the day of the suppression of the Abbey of wherever, and they leave each other some money. And they're also hoping their monastic way of life is going to come back. They're saving things in some instances from their monasteries, and actually, indeed, very briefly during the reign of Mary, a small number of monasteries are refounded. But there are clear signs in the letters and such others of monks and nuns from other monasteries that they hope their way of life is going to come back.
Yeah, and actually, Lucia is asking about how did the dissolution affect the future of Mary I? And I guess it was maybe a two-way thing. How did Mary I affect the dissolution? You just touched on it a little bit there, but maybe you could talk a little bit to that point.
Well, she grew up in a world of monasteries, and her mother, she was deeply pious. And just think, her mother was buried at Peterborough Abbey just years before it is suppressed. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why Henry can't quite, the number of former monastic churches are turned into cathedrals at this time, and Peterborough is one of them. And I wonder if it's to preserve the buildings around the bones of recently deceased Catherine of Aragon that happens. Now, Mary is a very, very traditional Catholic, and she refounds 6 monasteries in and around London, and she clearly envisages more foundations. And many of the personnel of those monasteries are former monks and nuns from monasteries that existed in the 1530s.
Right. Now, we haven't talked so much about the buildings and what happened to them. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what was the process of breaking them up, and what happened afterwards to these great buildings.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole range of things happen to them as well. You can go from somewhere like Westminster Abbey or Winchester Cathedral, Durham, which survived virtually intact, through to, let's say, Mews Abbey on the outskirts of Hull, where it's just earthworks. It's a whole range of destructive processes, and it's kind of dictated by needs and royal policy. Now, one thing the Crown is determined to do is to exact every single penny they can from the destruction of these religious houses, and also to make the ones they have made a firm decision to dissolve, that they are never, ever going to be inhabitable again by monks and nuns. So it's, first of all, everything is inventoried. When the monastery is suppressed, everything is inventoried. And for instance, the one at Rievaulx Abbey is fascinating because it goes from a gold and silver shrine above the high altar down to diverse bent old nails. Gives you an idea that everything, every last penny is going to be extracted from it. And then the work of destruction is, part of it originally is to eradicate them, but it becomes clear that they can't do that. So it's to make them unusable, and it's a skilled job. Destroying, actually, it's always worth as a building near you being demolished to watch the process of it, and you realise what a skilled job demolition is. And what a controlled job it is. And they employ highly skilled engineers in order to oversee the destruction of these monasteries. And it takes time and money. Early in the summer, last spring, just as the first lockdown happened, I was transcribing a document describing the last days of Furness Abbey up in Cumbria, and it described the taking down of the church using ropes and other engines, and it's a very, very detailed one, but there's no two ways about it. It is immensely destructive, and it's recognized at the time as being destroying cultural treasures. It was in, you had someone from Bury St Edmunds, one of the great centres of the church in England, going back to Anglo-Saxon times. The shrine of St Edmund had been destroyed shortly before the Dissolution, and this was an extraordinary thing which kings had paid homage to. The young Henry VI, I think it is, spends Christmas there one year, and there's a beautiful manuscript recording the event, and the shrine of Becket, that these things which have been things of wonder for centuries are being consciously destroyed. The dispersal of the monastic libraries, the things that just becoming stuff, that all the precious metal plate being carted away to be melted down. Everything that you can get farthing for will be sold. That's get down to gravestones in the church. That these stones had laid above the bones of a esteemed ancestor. You can turn that around, can't you? Use that for something else. And there's a heartbreaking description written by an Anglican clergyman in the late 16th century called Michael Sherbrook. It's based upon first-hand account of the destruction of Roach Abbey in South Yorkshire, which had been witnessed by his uncle and father, and how things just crashing down from the roof onto things beneath, the burning of the choir stalls, even though there's loads of other timber behind. I mean, they will sell things if they think there's a ready buyer nearby. But as I said, there's it's a lot of stuff. There are loads of vestments. I mean, another abbey I've been working on is Boxley. And, its vestments are valued at 22 quid, which is a fairly substantial amount of money. But you look at the Abbey's accounts of the 14th century, and one vestment alone they're buying is costing them 22 quid at that time. They were bargains to be had. The stained glass, the bell, they can't sell the bells. There are so many of them. There's so much lead, they can't sell it. Everything of value. And there's a really telling comment. Some of the listeners may have heard of John Bale. He's a he's a poet. He'd been a Carmelite friar, and he turned into a white-hot Protestant. And he described, and he's no friend of the monasteries. He writes, scurrilous, scatological attacks on them. But he describes the Reformation period in England, the Dissolution, as a wicked age, much given to the destruction of things memorable. And monasteries are talked about at the time as being great beauties of the land. And that, and what's happening when the commissioners come to dissolve at Jervo Abbey, which is, if you go to Jervo Abbey, it is not one of the great monastic ruins of England, let me tell you. It doesn't compare to Revo or Fountains. It's got its own beauty. The commissioner, he's one of the Darcys, I can't remember his first name. He goes on and he says, it's as fair a church as I ever did see. And then he oversees its destruction down to its foundations. The abbot carted away to be hung, drawn, quartered at the Tower of London.
Horrendous. It's just horrendous.
And that is, it's like, the cultural cost was phenomenal. That I think that 5% of medieval art survives from medieval England. Go to the monasteries, it can't be 1%. Not a single precious metal chalice survives with an identifiable English monastic provenance. And actually, and then you go to the libraries. More book, I think about 5,000 books survive with an English monastic provenance, and that sounds quite impressive. But when you think there are 800 monasteries and Revo Abbey, for instance, there would have been well in excess of 1,000 books there at the time of its suppression. 22 survive today. It was and some of them would be deliberate. Some of the real treasures were carted off the Royal Library. That's why they survive. Monks and nuns are putting them in their saddlebags as they go away, and they're even trying to preserve them intact in the hope the monastery will go up. But some of them have been just left to moulder. There's, the choir books at Roach are just left to moulder. It's just stuff. It's not esteemed. And they're also trying to destroy monastic histories as well, because they've shaped English history and English identity, and a new one is being forged. They're trying to forge a new one, and the monasteries don't have that key role in it anymore.
Doesn't it? To allow the new to emerge. Every time I talk to you, Michael, I get more emotional about it because you paint such a vivid picture. I can see it. I can see the destruction and the sorrow and the terror and the shock. The shock that people must have had just standing, looking at these enormous buildings coming down. It's quite incredible.
Yeah, this, I think I told you about when we were at Revo about the legend, which is recorded from the 17th century onwards, and it names actual monks. So I think it's probably true. It's a medieval legend that 2 monks of Revo had found an inscription in one of the Abbey's books that sort of suggested that the Abbey would one day not be there. And it was said that the monks threw the book aside in disbelief that such a thing could ever happen. And it came to pass. It was an extraordinary event. And it is one as well that, despite the construction of the historiography, which starts almost immediately, is almost immediately regretted by some people. They look at these shattered remains and the role that the monasteries played and think, God, you know what? I'm not so sure that was a good idea. Did we have to do this? Yeah. Don't do it to the same extent in other bits of Europe as well. The English Reformation is often seen as being terribly polite, isn't it? And we look at the horrible religious wars in France and and things like that, and well, gosh, we didn't descend into that. But it was incredibly destructive. And I studied history at a time, university, especially for my master's level, when the English Civil War was being reappraised as rather than being a political event, being a religious event. And one of the arguments being made at that time, back in the 1990s, again, I'm not going to comment, obviously the historiography will have moved on, but it was that all England did was postpone a religious war in the mid-16th century to a religious war in the mid-17th century. And England didn't do any better than these countries in terms of just death and destruction. But some of the best preserved medieval art in all of Europe survives in former monasteries in Lutheran Germany, and that shows that another way was possible.
Yes. Well, we are coming to the end. Can you believe it? We've been talking for nearly an hour. I just wanted to maybe just read you a few of the comments that people have just been leaving, just as we've been chatting. So let me see here. Kiri, gosh, the awful cultural destruction. That's awful. Helen is saying, this is fascinating. Thank you. I'm a history teacher and my year 11 study Croxton Abbey for the local history part of their course.
Yeah.
Helen, another Helen, really fascinating. I've really enjoyed learning about all these extra details about the dissolution monasteries. A very complex situation and galling behaviour on the part of Henry et al. Absolutely. Yeah, and Kiri's also saying, I'll now be checking out Dermot McCulloch's biography of Cromwell. I think it's very well thought of, isn't it?
Brilliant.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. So Anna's just said, love this chat. Thank you so much. Brilliant. So that's great. So before we finish our chat, I just wanted to ask you, are there any books that people could look out, check out that you've written, or any events that might be coming up? Where can people kind of connect with you, Michael?
Well, check out the English Heritage website for the podcasts, because I've done, as well as, none of them were on site with Sarah, and that was a highlight of 2020. One of our brief releases from lockdown, and spending that day with Sarah at Revo was magical. But I've done several of them on the English Heritage website for our podcast, and check those out. I think my last one was about medieval ghost story writing, which is another one of my big interests. I co-edited a book called Writing Britain's Ruins. It was published by the British Library in 2017, and it's about literary responses to English ruins, as much as historical responses, but that's a good read. I've written several English Heritage guidebooks for monastic sites, such as Hales Abbey, Cleeve Abbey. And I've also written a scholarly tome on the Cistercians and their art and architecture in Northern England in the late Middle Ages. And it's rather expensive, but if any of you have got a spare, you can get a second-hand copy. this is an idea of how expensive it's 65 quid for a second-hand copy. Oh. But if you've got, and yeah. I've written numerous nerdy articles as well in various journals. But I'm often on the media talking about things medieval and monastic. Some of you might have caught me talking about Christmas decorations, traditions around the time of Twelfth Night, and how you should be leaving them up till Candlemas, make your year a little bit brighter. And look, if you join English Heritage, I get the plug in there. Free entrance to all our sites, and I do a lot of members tours. It's one of my favorite bits of the job, actually interacting with our members and trying to convey some of my passion and for these sites, and bringing them alive for our visitors. I spent my early career doing jobs that I hated, and in my early 40s decided to go back to university and do a PhD because I loved the subject, and I landed on my feet with this job and the chance to give people a sense of that, my emotional connection with these sites, and to communicate some of my enthusiasm. And I'd also add, I'm a historian, and like all historians and art historians, I'm shaped by my own biases. So you could get a different perspective on the dissolution from other people, and that's what drives history forward. There is no such thing as one version of history or the definitive version of history. It's driven forward by people like me writing things and arguing in the politest possible way with other scholars about what was happening. We find different kinds of evidence or interpret it in different ways. So I'm not saying that what I'm saying is gospel. It's my take on it. I think it's supported by the evidence, and you can tell I passionately believe it as well. And I think it's a tale to be told that we haven't done these monasteries justice. And also, I go to places like Revo and Sawley and Worley, Glastonbury, and Glastonbury Tor was a place of horror when you think about what happened to that last abbot. And don't write out of English history the people who died opposing what becomes the official history. The dissolution of the monastery, I think, was horrific. It really, really was. And it was an epoch-making event in history, and historians have argued for decades and centuries over it, and I'm sure they still will. But let's not write out of it what really happened.
The human element. Let's not over-sanitize it, and remember what people stood for. So we are going to finish in a moment. We've had lots of people, as you've just been summing up there, saying some lovely things. So let me share those with you. We've got, thank you so much. This has been enlightening from Debbie. And we've got fantastic discussion. Thank you so much from Kiri and Anna. Oh, yes. So we've answered the question about where we can find out more about you. So that's good. Susan saying, this has been so interesting. The destruction of cultural history and the physical treasures is always heartbreaking. Thank you. Jew, thank you, love the chat. Carol, incredible. Lucia, thank you very much. This talk has been informative and entertaining, and so it goes on. And Michael, if you want to read the comments, hopefully, sometimes they appear in YouTube afterwards, sometimes they just magically disappear. I don't quite know what that is, but I'm going to say thank you so much, and just to acknowledge, thank you. You are donating a copy of Writing Britain's Past and the Visitor Guide to Hales Abbey to the patron program for podcasts, because as I mentioned, you were the guest on this month's podcast and you have kindly donated a copy of both of those. So folks out there, if you're interested in potentially being in to win a copy of those in this month's giveaway for my patron program on Podbean, you have to go over to my podcast. As I say, the link is in the description below. If you want to catch up on my chat with Michael at Revo, you really get the sense of being there on location, please do so. But hopefully I've covered all the ground. I do just want to make a slight apology, folks, and this is totally me, but I realise halfway through that I do have the logo slightly over Michael's forehead, and I didn't dare move it in the middle of the call in case I did something. It will make you laugh, guys, but just before we came on, I just pressed a button just to check something out, and everything went haywire. And I only just got it back together again, didn't I, Michael, to come on?
Indeed, yeah.
So I am really, really apologetic that you have the Tudor travel guide plastered across your forehead, and I
It's
will
not to hide a spot.
I will endeavour next time to make sure that it's plastered across my forehead, or preferably out of the way. So thank you everybody out there for being forgiving of that for me. So with that, Michael, I'm going to say thank you very much. But if you guys want to just stay on for a moment, I've just got a couple of things to say. But thank you so much, Michael, for taking part in our live chat.
My pleasure, honestly. One of the best Saturday nights I've had for ages.
Oh, brilliant. Excellent. Love it. Okay, love it. Okay, guys, I just want to wrap up here by saying a massive thank you to all of you who've come online this evening to join in the chat, to post your questions. I love being able to connect with you guys live. So thank you so much. And you make it, of course you do. What did I want to say here? What I want to just mention is next month's live chat. So as I mentioned, we are back first Saturday in the month. So that is, I think it's 5th of February. Anyway, it's the first Saturday in the month at 5 o'clock, between 5 and 6 p.m. And I'm going to be talking with historian and author Kate Williams. So now Kate has obviously written lots of books, including Rival Queens, which is obviously about Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. And Kate's going to be coming on to share her chat about the book. So again, if you love Elizabeth and Mary, you want to ask some questions about her. Of course, February is the anniversary of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, so perhaps it's an apt time to be talking about the two of those queens and their interesting relationship. Okay, so I think that's all. Just to say, if you're wondering what that is, if you want to, it's a QR code and it takes you through to my Instagram site. I'm doing a lot more on Instagram this year, so if you want to come on over and follow me on Instagram, because you don't yet, you just need to get your camera out. Hopefully it will click onto the code and it will take you through to my Instagram page, just in case you were wondering what that was all about. So thank you everybody, and I shall see you next month. All right, see you around the Tudor sphere. Bye bye.